So we've come close to the end of our day, and I want to thank all of you for being here. So we're just going to wrap up. I guess what I want to reflect on a little bit is just, I guess, sort of here's what I'm noticing. As I said earlier today, I've been in a lot of these conversations for the last 3 years in my role with the New Brunswick Business Council, and here's what I'm noticing. Herb started us off with a really good question today, is what problem are we trying to solve? And there is sort of this chicken and egg of immigration and economics and this idea of a small open economy. And I think Chris iterated it very well, is that we've got sort of two things on the go here, that and one is not going to solve the other, that we have to work on these things in tandem. So we had some different points of view, but I think at the end of the day, I think we're both are right. I thought Kelly was, in terms of debunking some of our myths, every time we have those conversations, there's always something new to be learned. And so I'm noticing that those kinds of conversations, we're getting a little bit more open to realizing our own blind spots, as Alex had put it. Noticing that we're all sort of now, we know what the issues are. I'm feeling a real shift towards the need to move towards action and solution. That we recognize the complexity of the systems, but I love what Mark just said, is 75% go. We're not going to have it perfect. And as Chris said, we are all learning from this together. And so what I'm noticing is a lot more, a more feeling that we're in this together and we're going to find the solutions together. One of my highlights from the day was to hear Esti's experience. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting, there was an immigration summit that was held by the province of New Brunswick, and just the diversity of people that were there was excellent. And it really made me laugh when Justin said, I always get the question, oh, you must be from here originally, or a family brought you here, or a job brought you here. I think one of the things that we could do personally is every time that we meet someone who is new to Atlantic Canada, to stop asking, why are you here? So for all of us Atlantic Canadians, we have to stop asking that question. We've got to turn it around and say, you are so lucky to be here. You're going to love it here. That should be the first thing out of our mouths. And so because you saw, I saw the joy in Esti's face. I saw it today, and I have to say that was one of the big highlights for me today. And I also want to acknowledge the direct presence of folks from the federal government. Marta, Paul McKinnon, Minister Hussein is the minister that I have seen in Atlantic Canada the most in my 25 years in the private sector. And so things like the Atlantic Immigration Pilot Program and the Atlantic Growth Strategy, I feel like, for someone who's lived in this region and sort of been an active in the community, I just feel like we're supported in our challenges and our work. So I can't thank you enough for those people who have come to work with us on some of our challenges. I feel like we are part of national issues, not working necessarily on our own. And from the two panels this afternoon, just as I mentioned earlier, really moving to action. We are starting to share with one another really what are those tangible ideas? What are those things that are working and that we can share with one another? So in closing, sort of three key things: economy, private sector, and personal. And to start with the economy, Herb did challenge us on what's that problem that we're trying to solve. And Saskatchewan came up a few times today, and I know there's probably some people in the room who are laughing right now because I always go back to this Saskatchewan example. And part of it was vision for what Saskatchewan was becoming. And I think one of the things in Atlantic Canada is that the World Economic Forum says that those countries that consistently lead in competitiveness, it's those countries where the private sector leads and creates a vision based on the assets that exist. And so alignment of government education around these focus areas is really key. And so when we can see who we are becoming from an Atlantic Canadian perspective and we work together on that, that's where I feel we can really be successful, and we will be the Saskatchewan story of tomorrow. In terms of the private sector, the second area I wanted to focus on that really stood out today is this need for private sector to be in the conversation. And I have to say that I've actually seen that improve, and it's one of the things that came out really clearly with the Economic Immigration Lab, is that that is one of our key challenges. And I'm starting to see that shift. But there's some real work there. And the commitment that I want to make, and it's my offer to anyone who'll work with me, in my role at the Business Council, anyone who wants to collaborate and work with us, that I commit today to, when we were talking with the employers here about sharing that toolkit, let's create that platform for private sector companies to come together. And one of the things, that was brought up is about we are a small business-based economy, and so we really need to work out some of those solutions. And I know Rob Kelly and his team, some of the things is that a lot of companies can't afford those human resources capacity inside their organization. But there's a real opportunity we have a lot of independent HR consultants in Atlantic Canada that work on their own, and they themselves are small business owners. And that's a real opportunity for those human resources consultants to really develop their own practice to be available to small business in order to help create some of those opportunities and those linkages. So, and Francis challenges us, this morning, is that the private sector, those companies have to ramp up, and they have to invest. And another thing that the private sector can be doing is to be a louder voice in some of the commentaries, some of the conversation around immigration. So share the story of what you're doing and what your challenges are. And often it feels like that's a voice that's missing. And finally, one of the other things is universities are really working, and community colleges are really working hard to create experiential learning opportunities for students. And so I would challenge universities and private sector is to ensure that we have a mix of students who are from the region, from Canada, but also create those opportunities, because only by linking international students to the opportunities that are here will we be able to retain and attract them. So universities and community colleges are really, we had a question from a gentleman from the New Brunswick Community College. So how private sector companies, think about where you can create co-op and internship programs and make those available for all students to connect them here to the region. And so finally, just on the third level, it was sort of that personal level, and that's the level I'd like to close on, is that one of the things when Amanda spoke about the Economic Immigration Lab, it's really about citizen-led action. And so my plea would be is, there's one of the things that the lab is doing is looking for teams that have an idea and have a project and want to test it out, and that want to find other people that are just as passionate about solving that same problem as they are. And so I would really encourage anyone who's interested to be in touch and to bring their solution and their idea into the lab. But then also, today I thought it was really interesting. There were a lot of times I found myself reflecting on how personally we can each take action. And it was Nancy that talked about walking through the glass wall. So I guess my challenge to myself and to each one of you is that how do we extend that hand and help someone walk through that glass wall? Either through our schools, our children are in schools, be involved with the ONB Connects program. Local chambers are doing great mentorship programs. Reach out and ask if they can be that introduction point for you. Start a fun Friday hour in your community. I love Angelique's idea as well, is just invite someone to come with you to, if it's open mosque evening, neighborhood events, spouses, cultural events, those kinds of things. So if we could all reflect here today about how we bring others along, because as Angelique said, we are all likely the converted. So Ed started out today by saying that we had green shoots, that there's often, we start out with The Economist, which typically brings you all the bad stats, and we all know that situation. But I would say that we, after hearing today and, hearing the experiences, the ideas, and the energy, that what we have here is more than green shoots. I think we've got a lot of promise, and we've got a lot more growth happening here than I think we give ourselves credit for. So the conversation, as I said, moved really today for me to action and solutions. So when it comes to policy direction and the work that the Public Policy Forum is doing here, I think the Public Policy Forum is in a really unique place to bring us together from an Atlantic perspective. And while there's been some collaboration, I think there's more opportunity for more. We're trying to solve this, this revitalization problem together, and I really think that the Public Policy Forum has, by being here today, is playing that role. But in their work here over the next 3 years with this project is in that unique position to really bring all of the stakeholders together and look at this from an Atlantic focus. I think as well, around in terms of policy direction, is this idea of engaging the private sector. And I think there's a little bit more myth debunking to do there. And one of the other policy questions that I think would be really interesting to explore is Herb brought up this morning about a low wage structure in Atlantic Canada. And I think he was speaking, for the entire region. And there was a question in the last panel with regards to sort of cheap, have you had to change your wages? And most people said, no, we try to sell the notion of a lower cost of living. But I think from a policy perspective, I think it would be really interesting to get underneath that question a little bit more. Francis started out this morning by saying that we were our advantage had always been sort of low labor costs. And I think we've got to get ourselves out of that thinking as well from a private sector perspective. And there was actually other research that was done by ACOA that was brought to my attention. It was done back in 2012, and they looked at the business culture in Atlantic Canada. And often where other jurisdictions move to innovation to address customer needs, often in Atlantic Canada, something that stood out is that we often move to price reduction. And so I think from a policy perspective, it'd be really interesting to explore that idea about how do we move from this low wage structure and move into more of looking about how do we compete on other ways other than always defaulting to looking at a lower price or a lower wage structure. So that would be an interesting question as well. And finally, I think Justin raised an excellent point around social license. And I think that is probably, when I think about the work that we need to do from here, I mentioned the personal piece, I mentioned the private sector and the economic level. But I think that there is, in the CRA research to say that 60% of Atlantic Canadians would think that we need same or less. I think that's where a big part of our work rests over the next couple of years, is to carry this conversation beyond sort of convention centers. And we saw some great ideas, Heather from the Dreamweavers, about how do we bring this into schools? How do we make that next generation help us? We did it on the environment. We can do it on this issue as well. We went right to the kids, and the kids trained us all on how to save the planet. And also to D with the toolkit and helping bring down barriers. So how do we bring those kind of real tangible ways? So I think there's some great examples that were brought here today, and we all have a role to play in that piece around social license. So in closing, I just want to thank once again Ed and your team from the Public Policy Forum for coming here to Atlantic Canada and to bring your resources and create this conversation around immigration revitalization in our region. So thank you for that. Also, thank you to the sponsors. I'm not sure that that slide is there anymore. But again, sponsors are so important to making these events happen. For all the speakers that took the time to prepare, all the moderators, and of course to all of you for taking the time out of your schedule to be here. It's an honor to have this time to spend with you, and thank you for allowing me to close the day with you. So thanks for being here. I also want to mention that the Frank McKenna Awards reception begins at 5 o'clock, and it's right here. Is it in? Yeah, right in this area here. So we have time for a little bit of refresh, and then we'll see you back here this evening at 5 o'clock. So again, thanks very much for your time.